watery context, we're going to pick up here back in Hebrews chapter 11. And we've been talking about Abraham. And last week we left off with the thought that he was to travel to a place in which he was going to receive an inheritance. Remember, we had left off in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen is talking to the religious leaders of the day, and because of this lesson, he's going to be stoned. But in the accounting of the history, he talks about Abraham. He talks about how he went out by faith, and yet he resided in a land that he never had a foothold in. In fact, the promise that was made to him was that he would have a land and he would be of a great nation, right? And yet that was never actually realized within his lifetime. And we made comment to that you and I are promised something, and we are striving and going to a land as well, and yet there's going to be a time when we realize it, but we are an impatient people, right? And Abraham's faith transcended that. The next phrase there in verse 8, and I should turn back to Hebrews here for just a moment to make sure of the wording. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8, and without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Verse 8. I read 6. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to the place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. So he obeyed and went. It says that immediately Abraham went. Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, which we read at the beginning of this. So when we think about his attitude, there was no hesitation there. There was no bargaining with God. There was no running away. And we talked initially about Abraham's faithfulness and how we see examples of hesitation or bargaining or running away throughout Scripture. Yes, Ray. Yeah.
I was out in California last week and it was a dead cell phone in Los Angeles. Okay. There's a lot of faith that I place in my ability to follow maps that in a city I've never been. Okay. And boy, do I have a high level of respect for those. I mean, I remember the Atlas. Okay, I was an Atlas kid in the backseat, but like before the Atlas, right? Before maps were even readily available, Abraham left
Right.
land without the way that my Bible reads, even though he did not know where he was going. So
Right.
it was a fact.
Right.
And so he followed that,
right.
Walking into the wilderness by faith. It's huge.
Yep. And so literally one step in front of the other, not knowing his destination. And in fact, when you think about that never receiving, now he would sojourn in that land, but it would not be his. And so, I think that's something we'll discuss here a little bit more as we move on. This really demonstrated his trust in God, right? If you look at James chapter 2, and this is, sometimes we have verses that are about something else. Well, this is kind of a verse about something else, but it gives us some more insight into Abraham himself. And in James chapter 2, starting in verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works. And as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. So the passage is really a discussion about faith and works and the intertwining of those two, right? But we see more information. We see things about the character of Abraham, namely about his faith. And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, it's talking about faith and works. And if you noticed, did you find anything interesting about verse 21? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar? Now, if you had no history with the Old Testament, if you were somebody that just picked up scripture for the first time, and you read that verse, you would say what about Abraham? He offered up his son. Did he offer up his son? He was prepared to. You know, I went back and read every um, uh, translation of this, and they all read the same, as though he offered him up. And the literal translation is, having brought up his son Isaac on the altar. So the literal translation, when they read that, they can't alter that anyway except to make it easier for us to read, and that he offered up his son. But God stopped him. But you know, we see this many times where God prophesies something and then talks about it as though it has already happened, right? That's a theme in Scripture. And because God said it's going to happen, it's as if it's already happened. And that is the way it is with Abraham and offering Isaac. Abraham was willing, and the Lord stopped him. And so, man, of all the things to talk about with Abraham, what an awesome thing. And it says that he was a friend of God. He was willing to do it. And perhaps Abraham is able to illustrate his faith to God with a likeness to what God ends up doing for you and I in sacrificing his own son for our salvation, for our opportunity of salvation, if you will. Any thoughts about that? Okay.
I would say Abraham going to offer his son. In Canaan, child sacrifice was not unheard of. And you know, in modern times, it's such a alien concept to sacrifice a child. But back then, it was a lot more common than it should have been. And not only was Abraham willing to do it because he trusted God, God also proceeded to say, hey, you don't have to do this. You know, I commanded you to do this, you were willing to do it, but you don't have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm different than the other false gods around you. I am the true God. And the true God does not want human blood for his sacrifice. And that's something just another thing to see is just God showing there through, you know, Abraham's willingness is I'm different.
Mm-hmm.
This is, you know, I'm not who you've heard of.
Mm-hmm. Did Abraham do everything right? No. In fact, when it comes to his sons, what did they do incorrect? Didn't Sarah have to plan? I said, here, take my handmaiden and have a child? And subvert God's plan or change it or try to change it? Now, God's plan was still going to bear out, right? Is this not the offspring that Abraham was promised to build this lineage, this great nation upon? And now he's asked to sacrifice the very thing? And so, and yet he was willing to do that. And so he must have had in the back of his mind, I don't know how this is going to work, but this is what he's told me to do, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to be faithful in this. And so I think, you know, Abraham is not unlike you and I in that we tend to make mistakes. We sometimes tend to subvert God's plan for us. We become what? Impatient? Not willing to let him work in the time and space that he has in mind. And yet then hopefully we rise to the occasion at times and illustrate a great faith. So, any other thoughts about that before we move? Yeah, Ron.
In verse 19, it does kind of give the, like, maybe what Abraham was thinking. It said he considered that God was able to raise him from the dead, so he must have just been well
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which,
Still to kill yourself.
right. Right. But Abraham, obviously, through inspired scripture we read, was more than willing to do that because it claims that he offered him, and I think that's a really telling verbiage as to his. Of course, God would know what's in his heart and his willingness. Of course, we have it recorded for us, but God knows the man. Anybody else? Okay. Um, So Abraham's journey from Haran to Canaan is a physical manifestation of his spiritual journey of faith. And so as God tells him to go, he strikes out and he literally starts walking to where he does not know. And that is very familiar to our spiritual journey of faith. I have some themes here, some things that I think we can derive from what he has done. I thought you would maybe think about these things and maybe have some comment about them. Obedience often starts with one step, but not with full comprehension. Obedience starts with one step, but not full comprehension. You know, I think of the individual that understands the life-giving benefit of the blood of Christ and stepping out and saying, "I want to meet Him in baptism," and they take that first step, if you will. Do they comprehend all that's going to be asked of them? You know, Saul was ministered to by Ananias. And we have the benefit of God telling Ananias to go and teach him because he's a chosen vessel of mine or servant, and he's going to learn what he must suffer for my name's sake. I don't know if Paul was privy to all that yet. But when Paul took that first step and was baptized, that put him on a road that was going to see a lot of pain, a lot of suffering for his name's sake. I don't think you and I are challenged quite as Paul was. I don't know that God has in mind for us the things that he put Paul through or allowed him to go through. But we're going to have our days, aren't we? And anybody that's walking this walk knows that we're going to have our days. And so we are going to, like Paul, be asked to buffet our body, I think, at times. We're going to be asked to stand up to false doctrine. We're going to be asked to go out and teach and preach, and we're going to be rejected at times. And so we're going to suffer some of the same things. So obedience often starts with one step, not with full comprehension. You know, maybe that's a bit of a saving grace. Maybe if we knew at the beginning the struggles that we might have, we might turn away because we wouldn't acknowledge the blessings that are going to come as well. And we are weak people. We are frail. We are carnal in nature. And yet it's God through these blessings that strengthens us and allows us to continue with that next step and the next step. And so I think maybe we are fortunate in some regards that we don't know the struggles we will face. But I know with God's blessings, we can face whatever comes our way. Even to temptation, which we're told that we will not be subject to anything that we can't handle. Any other thoughts about that theme? Yeah, Mark.
Yesterday morning, I put a butterfly in the yard while I was watering the grass, and I found it recently. Made me think of Kelly's class last week, and his thought too about being transformed and renewing our minds, and that metamorphosis we had talked about in the past, the caterpillar, and how we need to be totally transformed through the Word of God, through His Spirit, and that's a daily thing. And that butterfly made me think of the things of last week too, in the news of dad's cancer and even and so many that are struggling with their health or mom.
Yeah.
And like you said, we all got so much to go through in life, and we have good days where everything seems once in a while, a little perfect, you know, and
Right.
we have bad days with bad moods, but every morning we should wake up and pray, dear Lord, whatever's coming my way this day, give me the strength, give me the wisdom, to handle it in a Christ-like manner, and to have that, you know, that peace that surpasses all understanding, no matter what
Right.
happens. And your thought about, you know, our faith being a sacrifice to our children, uh, is so awesome. I mean, that's the best sacrifice we can give to our children, and show them a life of our faith, but we can't pass that on.
Right.
And all we can do is be an example, but it's such a continual thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, Christianity is 100% every day. It's not on
Right.
and off. I can't put it on Sunday and
Right.
forget about it the rest of the week. It's daily.
Right. You know, we can't force it on, for example, like our children or our loved ones. But proximity means something, doesn't it? And so when we do, what a wonderful thing that is too. You know, back to that thought about Job in verse 5. That's not worry. You know, Job is not consumed with worry or fretting. Is he concerned? Yes. But apparently it's a godly concern. It's a godly thought because he was faithful in all these things. And so I think that's so encouraging. You know, the second one is very much like what Mark is just talking about. Obedience may look costly, but God exchanges the temporal for the eternal. You know, I think as we mature, as we become stronger Christians, I think this is easier for us to accept. My dad has been telling me for 10 years I'm leaving. You guys will have to deal with that. And he's got me to the point now where it's just like he's like, I'm dying soon. He's almost embracing. Let me out of here. And in some ways, I love that attitude. You know, uh, we are exchanging the temporal for the eternal when we serve Him. And I think as we become more faithful, it becomes easier for us to accept that. You know, here again, we are caught in a worldly world, right? Everything is about the me and the here and the now. And that's pervasive in our society. When you go home today after you eat dinner or you turn the TV on, you're going to see commercial after commercial after commercial about what you need or what you should have, or what you should desire. And all that stuff gets into our mind and works against this. We got to be willing to shed the temporal for the eternal, and God will help us do that. Any thoughts about that? Everybody see that happening in your life? I mean, somebody else can speak personally except me this morning, right?
I can speak to the way, I guess, we perceive death, the way I process it, my father was, is the kids talk to me about it all the time. Right? And then for me, it's consciously, it's a thought that I do push out of my head. I just don't,
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to dwell on that component of the life. But whenever they bring it up, I always spin it. He's happy, his legs work, he's with Jesus, you know, and what that's done for me is almost caused a neural pathway in my brain to form, to where it doesn't hurt me as much anymore because I know he's happy, his legs hurt, he's
Right.
with Jesus.
Right.
And what else could I want from him?
Mm-hmm.
To be here with me in this mess? No way. So,
It's a good thought. Anyone else? The next phrase in our passage in Hebrews is without knowing where he was going. Abraham's journey symbolizes a Christian's walk of faith, whose faith leads a believer into the unknown, relying on God's promise. The scripture tells us that without knowing where he was going. Proverbs chapter 3, verse we're pretty familiar with. Proverbs chapter 3. Verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. Verse 6, in all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your paths straight. You know, verse talking about giving to God, and he'll help us with that journey. He's going to make our paths straight. That, of course, symbolizing something that we can do, something that we can accomplish. You know, 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 is a verse we've talked about several times. We walk by faith, not by sight. And as we wrap up this verse, here's a thought I'd like to present you and let you think about it. We surrender the illusion of control, yet we have peace. We surrender the illusion of control, and yet we have peace. What do you think of when you hear that? When you consider that verse? Okay, put all of your trust in God. How much control do we have over our life? Yeah, we don't have much, do we? We can fall victim to other people's problems or malfeasance, if you will. Things, you know, we're in a dying world. That dying world can attach itself to us at any point of life. And yet, so many people today live with the idea that they're living for themselves, right? They have control. I remember, and I've watched this documentary twice now of the bombing of Oklahoma City, the Federal Bureau building. That was accomplished by Timothy McVeigh. Parked a Ryder truck in front of theirs full of diesel fuel and ammonia nitrate or what have you. Made a huge bomb. Blew that building apart. Killed so many people, and a great number of them were children in a daycare at the lower floor of that building. Unspeakable thing that he did. And you know, when he is strapped down and they're ready to do a lethal injection to him, he's like, I am my own king. I make my own way. And there's a great quote that he quotes, a very famous writer, in his dying words. He's strapped to a gurney about to be executed by the federal government. He was in control of nothing. But that was his thought. And I think so many today are wrongly walking around thinking that they are in control. And they're not. It's actually an illusion. It's not real. And so when we strike out and we don't know where the pathway, you know, I think we know the destination, right? But we don't know the pathway to it as we plod along through this life, even serving God. And so we are a bit as though we are out of control. We just put this into God's hands, saying, God, you take care of me, you lead me, I'm living for you. But yet, we have a peace. And I think that's a tremendously important component. It's going to keep us grounded. It's going to keep us comforted. It's going to allow us to continue on, even when we don't know where the next step will be. And so, God's plan is so wonderful in this regard. Thoughts about that? Okay, we've got plenty philosophical here with Abraham. Back to Hebrews chapter 11. I will tell you, when you get opportunity to preach, you burn up notebooks in a hurry. So I get to start a new notebook. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9. By faith he lived as an alien in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. By faith, it says, of course, this is our theme. This continues as we move through Hebrews chapter 11. He dwelt in the promised land. Abraham's faith illustrates his willingness to live in a land that was not yet his, trusting God's promise for the future. Remember, we already referenced this morning Acts chapter 7, which in fact he never had a foothold in it. He was in a land that he did not own or personally possess, but he did live there. Then the question is, did he ever waver? Absolutely. We've talked a little bit about that this morning. I guess when I think about Abraham and his being faithful to God, and then one of the first episodes we read of is when there's a drought in the land and he has to go to Egypt, and he concocts a sequence of events, or what does he do? What does he ask of his wife Sarah? The Old Testament scholars. Yeah, claim that you're my sister so it'll go well for me, and they won't kill me because you're beautiful. She must have been really beautiful. That's all I got to say, right? And this turns out bad for the Egyptians. It turns out good for him in that he is rewarded with many things, and then he's told to leave with them. But I think we see failure in Abraham at several turns. We must trust in God even when God's promises are not immediately filled. And so I would imagine that in the back of Abraham's mind, as he sojourns through this land, he's probably wondering, when will God allow all of this to take place? When is this going to happen? And the truth was, some of it was not going to be realized by him. And so he had to deal with that. He had to overcome that. And I think you and I will overcome situations like that too. Sometimes we have a vision in our mind of what our life should be. And we start on this journey, and all of a sudden, that's not possible. Maybe I didn't receive the grades to do such and such in my education, or maybe my financial position doesn't allow me to attain this. And then so we have to recompute, right? We have to decide, hey, am I going to continue this path? Am I going to be faithful to the Lord, even though it seems to be costing me something, or I'm having to change maybe what I thought I was going to be. And so we have to die to self in this event, and certainly Abraham was challenged with these very things. Any thoughts about the first phrase? It talks about he did this as a stranger in a foreign country. So Abraham lived as a stranger in a foreign land. This again is a biblical theme. Remember, believers are said to be sojourners on earth. And it points to the fact that life is transient on earth, and we anticipate heaven. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. We have to come to terms with the idea that this is not our home. And that's part of the rub, right? This is a place that we strive for comfort. We strive for security. And we want all those things. And yet we have to remember this is not our home. In fact, we are sojourners in a land. Now, I think this is incredibly difficult for you and I to do. Because I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But we live in the greatest nation on the face of the earth. I'll argue with anybody that wants to argue with me on that. We have freedoms, and we have wealth, and we have opportunity that you just don't see in other lands. And because of that, because of our blessings, because of the things that God has really given our country, our people, it's almost as though we don't need him. Thanks anyway, I'm fine. It's our spirit to be self-efficient. Like I may not have it all, but guess what? I don't need anything from you. I can take care of myself. And we thrive on that as a people. And yet, I think our brethren in other parts of the country or other places of the world that are not, it seems crazy, but encumbered with our wealth are maybe uh, can handle this thought a little better than you and I can. The thought that we are just simply sojourners here and we desire for that next place. I mean, when our lives are so good, heaven has to be really good, has to be really great. But it is. And so you and I get caught up in our wealth. We get caught up in our blessings that come to us naturally as citizens of this land. And we need to be very cautious about how that affects us. What that requires of our day-to-day life that we maybe take off our service to God or take away from. So something really to consider, I think. So Abraham lived as a stranger in a foreign land. He was an alien. We are aliens on this earth. We are headed to another place. Any thoughts about that point? Yeah, Ken.
I guess kind of look at that. People in India definitely support call it baptism. You read it and the word of God says elements of it. People don't have much, but yet they see a better life afterwards.
Right.
Being baptized in Christ. Whereas we basically have it all.
Yeah.
And take their possession and think, oh, that's all. People and stuff that
Right.
would be better than this, which we know it is.
Right.
So many people within not just the US, but other parts of the world.
Right.
Take God for granted, but want to have that faith and belief because
Yeah.
we've got so much here.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see examples of that in our acquaintances, right? I think we see people that have dedicated themselves to building something or creating something, and it's tremendous what they can do. And I'll tell you, if you set your mind and heart to something, in this country you can have just about anything. You really go out and you work for it. You educate yourself on that thing, and you apply yourself to it. I truly believe you can have just about anything. But at some point, you're going to leave. And what you have done will be left to another. And they'll be broken up, or another one will sit over it, or what have you. We don't take any of it. And so you're familiar with that. You understand exactly, I think, what I'm saying there. He lived in tents, just as did Isaac and Jacob. And so it says that Abraham here lived in tents, so did his sons. Tents represent what? Yeah, nomadic lifestyle, temporary, mobility. We see this with the Native Americans, right? They lived in tents and they would follow herds that they were living off of. And of course, they developed a culture that was very thankful to the earth and its animals, and they recognize that. But it's a very nomadic lifestyle, and that they can move around very quickly. We're out of time. We'll pick up there next week and continue talking about the way in which Abraham and his sons lived in this land. Any last thoughts?